When a voidship is swallowed by the warp, crewman Jerk Venn must face horrors beyond reason as reality unravels, and discovers that the true terror is what's outside, but what waits inside them all. The alarm started during third shift, when the ship was quiet enough that even the sound of coolant dripping through the bulkhead seemed too loud. Jerk Venn was halfway through his inspection route in the starboard maintenance artery when the first klaxon shrieked, echoing down the narrow corridor like a wounded animal. It wasn't the sound that made his stomach tighten. It was the light. The lumen strips flickered once, twice, then went out entirely, plunging the artery into darkness that felt alive. He froze mid-step, fingers brushing the cold metal wall as if touch alone could anchor him to reality. "Bridge to all decks," came the captain's voice, distorted through the vox. "Unscheduled translation event detected. Secure all stations. This is not a drill." Jerk didn't need the warning. He'd served 6 years aboard the St. Valiant, long enough to know what those words meant. The warp was close. Translation events were supposed to be controlled, timed with the choir's guidance and the navigator's blessing. Unscheduled meant something had gone wrong badly. He pushed himself forward, boots echoing on the metal deck, each step heavier than the last as the emergency red lumen sputtered back to life, painting the corridor in bloody light. He wasn't the only one moving. Crew members emerged from adjoining shafts and compartments, faces pale, eyes wide. Some ran, some whispered prayers to the Emperor under their breath, some just stood still, as if disbelief alone might stop what was coming. Jerk caught sight of Sierra Lind, one of the junior astropaths, clutching her head as if trying to squeeze out a scream. Her sightless eyes were rolled back, blood trickling from her nose. 2 medici rushed past, dragging her toward the infirmary, but he could still hear her voice, raw and hoarse, babbling a litany of numbers and names that made no sense. He reached the nearest stairwell and began climbing toward the upper decks. The ship shuddered, a long, slow groan as if the hull itself were resisting some immense force. Somewhere distant, metal screamed. The lights flared again, brighter this time, then dimmed to a sickly orange. Over the vox came the navigator's voice, not words, just a single, terrible sound, a choking wail that cut through every deck before being abruptly silenced. That was worse than anything else. Navigators didn't scream. By the time Jerk reached Deck 12, order had begun to unravel. The officers barked commands, but the crew responded like sleepwalkers. Some ignored orders entirely, others moved with panicked urgency, clutching personal relics and family keepsakes like charms against damnation. He pushed his way through the throng toward the maintenance control hub, where Chief Engineer Halbrecht was already hunched over a hololithic display, sweat glistening on his bald head despite the cold. "We've lost navigator input," Halbrecht muttered without looking up. "Astropathic choirs down to 3 conscious members. Gellar fields fluctuating. Emperor help us." Jerk felt his throat tighten. The Gellar field was the only thing standing between them and the nightmare beyond. If it failed, even for a heartbeat, the warp would seep in like smoke through cracks. "What caused it?" he asked. Halbrecht finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and ringed with exhaustion. "Something's pulling us. We tried to break translation, but it's too late. We're inside." The words fell like stones. Inside. That meant the St. Valiant had slipped, or been dragged fully into the warp without preparation. No navigational shielding, no sanctioned path, just naked reality exposed to the Imperium's hunger. The deck vibrated beneath their feet. Panels along the walls popped open with sharp reports as conduits overloaded. A wave of heat washed through the hub, and for a second Jerk thought he saw movement in the hololithic display. Not glitches, but shapes, curling tendrils of darkness pressing against the projected star maps like hands against thin glass. "Seal all non-essential bulkheads," Halbrecht barked. "Route power to the Gellar field generators. I want every coil humming at maximum." Jerk turned to obey, but before he reached the control panel, the lights died again. This time they didn't come back. A noise, faint but growing, rose through the darkness, whispering like countless voices just out of hearing, sliding through the air. It wasn't coming from the Vox. It was coming from the walls. Someone screamed. A young deckhand staggered backward from the bulkhead, clutching at his ear as blood ran between his fingers. "It's in the metal," he gasped. "It's talking, Emperor, it's talking." The emergency lumens flared weakly, casting jagged shadows across the room. The walls themselves seemed to breathe. Jerk backed away from the bulkhead, heart pounding, every instinct screaming to run. But there was nowhere to run. They were adrift in a sea of madness, and the tide had just started to rise. The Vox crackled again. "All hands, this is Captain Dravik. Report to emergency stations. Gellar field instability detected across multiple decks. Repeat." The message cut off mid-sentence. The ship lurched violently, throwing Jerk against a console. Sparks exploded overhead. Through the viewport behind Halbrecht, the stars were gone. Only a swirling, luminous void remained, alive with impossible colors and shapes that seemed to move when unobserved. Sierra Lynn's babbling came back to him then, numbers and names, repeated like a mantra. He hadn't understood them before, but now they echoed through his mind with unsettling clarity. He didn't want to think about why. From somewhere deep within the ship, a sound rose, slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat magnified 1,000-fold. It reverberated through the decks, vibrating the air itself. Every lumen flickered in unison. The Gellar field was faltering. Jerk looked at Halbrecht, but the engineer's face was pale and unreadable. Around them, the crew shifted nervously, listening as the heartbeat grew louder, closer. In that moment, Jerk realized the Saint Valiant was no longer moving under its own power. It was being drawn towards something. The Vox came alive one last time with a shriek of static and a single, panicked voice. "It's inside the field." Then silence. Jerk didn't need to ask what that meant. He could already feel it, pressing against the edges of his thoughts like cold fingers probing for cracks. Something had entered their sanctuary. Something hungry. The emergency corridors were choked with bodies, but it wasn't chaos, at least not yet. People moved with the desperate precision of those clinging to a sinking vessel, driven by a shared, unspoken understanding that something had fundamentally broken. Jerk forced his way through the crush, the ship's heartbeat reverberating through the walls like the pulse of a dying god. Every so often the lumens would flicker, and in that half-light, faces seemed to warp. For brief, terrible instants, he would catch glimpses of something beneath the surface of human skin. Eyes where they didn't belong, mouths forming silent shapes, skin crawling as if something inside strained to break free. Then the lights steadied, and everything looked normal again, except it never would be. He pushed through a knot of crewmen clustered around a shrine alcove. The small votive candles were guttering in the stale air, wax dripping down like blood. A preacher in tattered robes was leading them in the litany of containment, his voice trembling as he urged them to hold fast to their faith. Jerk didn't stop to listen. He'd seen enough desperate prayers to know their power here was as thin as the metal separating them from the warp outside. Faith might comfort, but steel and machinery were what kept you alive. The stairwell down to the generator deck smelled like burnt insulation and hot oil. Somewhere below, a transformer had blown. He could hear the periodic thuds of failing circuits echoing upward. He descended quickly, gripping the handrail as the ship shuddered again, a long, low groan that reverberated through the superstructure. As he reached deck 16, the temperature dropped suddenly. His breath fogged in the air. The walls were slick with condensation, though the coolant pipes were nowhere near here. It was as if the ship itself were sweating in fear. At the base of the stairwell, 3 bodies lay sprawled in unnatural positions, limbs bent at impossible angles. Their eyes were open but unfocused, mouths stretched wide in silent screams. He recognized one of them, Toma, a maintenance apprentice barely 17, always eager, always asking questions. There wasn't a mark on him, but the expression frozen on his face was worse than any wound. It was as if something had hollowed him out from the inside and left the shell behind. Jerk forced himself to step over them. He couldn't stop now. The Geller field generators were their only hope, and if they failed completely, the ship wouldn't last minutes. As he moved down the main access corridor, he heard voices, soft, urgent, coming from the control chamber ahead. Halbrecht had sent a repair team ahead of him, but the sound that reached his ears was wrong. There was laughter in it, high and brittle, like glass cracking under pressure. He rounded the corner and froze. Two techs were at the control panel, their hands moving feverishly across the controls, but they weren't repairing anything. They were tearing it apart. Panels lay scattered on the deck, wires ripped free, conduits spilling coolant like blood. One of the techs, Marek, was humming tunelessly, a child's melody warped into something grotesque. His other hand was plunged into the console, sparks dancing around his fingers. "Marek," Jerk shouted, "what in the Emperor's name are you doing?" Marek's head snapped toward him too fast, vertebrae popping audibly. His eyes were completely black, reflecting no light, and his smile was wide enough to split his cheeks. "He's here," Marek whispered. "He showed us the truth." Jerk didn't wait. He lunged forward, grabbing the nearest metal bar and swinging it hard. The blow connected with Marek's temple with a sickening crunch, dropping him instantly. The other tech, Elira, let out a shriek and scrambled backward, eyes wide with terror, but it was clear she wasn't possessed, just broken. "He said the machine's wrong," she babbled, pressing herself against the bulkhead. "He said the field's a lie, that it keeps us blind, but he can see through it. He's coming, don't you understand? He's coming." Jerk ignored her, focusing on the console. The damage was severe but not irreparable. The backup relays were intact, though they'd been deliberately severed. Marek hadn't been trying to fix anything. He'd been trying to invite something in. The realization sent a shiver through him. If the warp could twist loyal crew this quickly, their chances were far worse than he'd imagined. He set to work, hands moving automatically. Years of maintenance work had trained him to think clearly under pressure, to fall back on routine when everything else failed. Reconnect the relays, check the capacitors, stabilize the flow regulators. Each task gave him a small anchor, a point of sanity amid the growing madness. Elira's muttering continued in the background, a constant reminder of how close the edges were fraying. Halfway through the repair, the whispering returned. Not through the Vox, not from any identifiable source, but inside his skull. It was faint at first, like an echo, but grew steadily louder. He tried to block it out, focusing on the glowing rune displays, but the voices threaded through his thoughts like oil seeping into cloth. "Jerk." He jerked upright, nearly dropping the tool in his hand. The voice had used his name. It was neither male nor female, neither human nor entirely alien. It was familiar in a way that made his skin crawl. "Jerk, why struggle?" it whispered. "The tide rises, the walls crumble, open the door." He slammed his fist against the console, trying to drown it out. "Get out of my head," he muttered. Elira was watching him now, her expression caught between fear and understanding. "You hear it too," she whispered. He didn't answer. He couldn't afford to. The field was still unstable. He could see the fluctuations rippling across the rune screen like waves. If they didn't stabilize it soon, there wouldn't be a ship left to save. He pushed the voice aside with sheer force of will, focusing on the relays, rerouting power from non-essential systems. The hum of the generators deepened, the lights steadied slightly, and for the first time in what felt like hours, he felt a flicker of hope. That was when the bulkhead at the far end of the corridor buckled. Not exploded, buckled inward, like thin foil pressed by some immense, unseen force. The metal groaned, rivets popping free one by one. Elira screamed and bolted for the stairwell, but the buckling stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving a warped dent that steamed in the cold air. Jerk stood frozen, staring at the bulkhead. He'd seen what void pressure could do to metal. This wasn't that. This was something inside the field pressing to get in, or something inside the ship pressing to get out. The Vox crackled overhead, startling him. "All crew to muster stations," came Captain Dravik's voice, strained and tight. "Containment breach on Deck 10. Security teams en route. Hold your positions and await further." The message cut off with a sound like tearing fabric. The ship lurched sideways, lights flickering madly. Jerk grabbed the console to stay upright as alarms blared again, overlapping in a cacophony of warning tones. Somewhere far above, metal screamed like a living thing being torn apart. Then faint but unmistakable, he heard it again, the heartbeat, louder now, closer. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, pressing against every wall, vibrating through every beam. The ship wasn't merely drifting through the warp anymore. It was being hunted. And for the first time, Jerk realized something that froze his blood. The heartbeat wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within the ship itself. Jerk didn't sleep. No one did. The ship's artificial night cycle dimmed the corridors to a sickly half-light, but there was no real darkness anymore, not in the warp. Every lumen flicker felt deliberate, like a blink from something watching. He sat on the floor beside the humming console, his back pressed against the bulkhead where the metal had warped hours before, trying to keep his breathing steady. The others had fled when the lights spasmed again, but he couldn't leave. He didn't trust the corridor. He didn't trust the stairwell. Truthfully, he didn't even trust his own senses anymore. The hum of the Gellar field had changed. Before, it was a steady, mechanical drone, comforting in its predictability, the sound of survival. Now there were fluctuations, subtle at first like distant wind in cavernous places, but slowly growing more pronounced. Every time the pitch dipped, a cold sensation swept over him as if the air itself recoiled. And beneath the hum, like a faint undertow beneath crashing waves, there was something else. A rhythm, pulsing, coordinated. He thought of Merrick's face, the black eyes, the smile stretched too far. He thought of the bodies in the stairwell, their mouths frozen mid-scream. He thought of the whisper that had used his name like a hook. Why struggle? The Vox unit above him coughed static, then cleared. A woman's voice, tight but composed, came through. All engineering personnel report to muster chamber C. All decks are to prepare for emergency field modulation. This is not a drill. Repeat, muster chamber C. It was Overseer Varen, reliable, hard as nails. If she was calling a muster, the situation had escalated far beyond his immediate repairs. He wiped his greasy hands on his coveralls and forced himself to stand. The corridor seemed narrower now, though he knew it was. Every surface felt subtly warped, like the ship was quietly twisting around him. He shook his head hard as if to dislodge the thought and began walking. The journey to muster chamber C was a descent, not just physically deeper into the vessel but emotionally, psychologically. The crew he passed were haggard and silent, their movements jerky, uncertain. They clung to their faith icons, muttered half-remembered prayers, refused to meet each other's eyes. A group of armsmen stood at an intersection, lasguns held tight, not at the ready but clutched like talismans. Their sergeant was whispering instructions, his voice cracking with every third word. And yet in that silence, Jerk felt something else. It wasn't fear, at least not theirs. It was anticipation, as if the ship itself were holding its breath. Muster Chamber C was half full when he arrived. The room, usually a place of organized bustle during drills, was a mess of scattered tools, crates, and improvised shrines. Someone had dragged a statue of the Emperor from the chapel and propped it against the bulkhead. Candles burned at its feet, the wax pooling in the uneven decking. Overseer Varen stood on the raised dais, Vox grill strapped to her jaw, barking orders. "Get those capacitor readouts up. I want live feed from every relay junction. We're not losing another segment to these fluctuations." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the haze like a whip. Jerk found a console at the edge of the room and began feeding in diagnostics. The data scrolling across the screen made his stomach drop. The Gellar field wasn't just weakening, it was degrading from within. There were fluctuations originating from places that didn't exist on any schematics, like hidden knots buried in the structure itself. He flagged one particularly concerning spike near the primary plasma conduits. Varen caught the signal and stalked over, her short-cropped hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. "You found something." He pointed at the anomaly. "Here, there's no physical junction there. It's inside the shielding. Could be a leak, could be interference, but—" "It's not interference," she interrupted grimly. "We've had 5 separate readings like this across 3 decks. It's moving, slowly, and it's converging toward the center of the ship." "Moving?" he echoed. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she lowered her voice. "Jerk, have you heard it? The heartbeat." The fact she said it so plainly made his skin crawl. "Yes," he admitted. Her eyes flicked toward the ceiling. "Everyone has. We're not reporting it officially, but the captain knows. There's something inside the field. Not a breach, not yet. Something riding the field." Riding the field. The words felt wrong in his mouth. The Gellar field was supposed to be a barrier, a bulwark against the madness of the warp. Nothing rode it. Nothing should. A young ensign rushed in, nearly tripping over a cable. "Overseer, the portside shrines are reporting visions again. Whole corridors are locking up, people just stopping. They won't move, won't speak." Varen swore softly. "We're out of time." She climbed back onto the dais. "Listen up. We're initiating a full harmonic modulation of the field. We're going to shake whatever's clinging to us loose before it settles in any deeper. This isn't standard procedure. If it goes wrong, we could lose half the relays in one blow. But if we don't, this thing's going to crawl right into our guts and tear us apart from the inside. Understood?" A low murmur rippled through the crowd, but there was no dissent. Everyone understood. It was either act now or wait to be devoured. Jerk returned to his station, fingers flying over the input keys. Harmonic modulation was risky, yes, but he'd helped run one once before, years ago, during a training drill. The idea was simple: alter the frequency of the Gellar field just enough to destabilize unwanted warp resonance without compromising the barrier. In practice, it was like shaking a building to dislodge a parasite buried in its foundations. The countdown began, 30 seconds. The hum of the ship deepened, a low bass thrum that vibrated through bone and metal alike. Candles flickered wildly. The statues seemed to shiver. The heartbeat quickened, keeping pace with the modulation frequency, as if aware of what was happening. 20 seconds. A sound like whispering wind swept through the chamber, but there was no wind. People glanced around uneasily. One of the younger techs started muttering prayers under his breath, rapid fire, eyes wide. 10 seconds. The lights dimmed further. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, pooling in corners they had no right to exist in. For an instant, Jerk swore he saw the shadow of a hand reaching from the ceiling. He blinked, and it was gone. 5, 4, 3, 2. The ship screamed. There was no other word for it. A vibration ripped through the decks, a sound so intense it bypassed ears and drilled straight into the brain. Every lumen flared white, then plunged the room into darkness. The harmonic surge hit like a hammer. Jerk clung to the console as reality itself seemed to twist. The walls bent inward then outward like lungs inhaling and exhaling. The air turned viscous. His ears popped, his teeth ached, his vision doubled. And then silence. The lights returned in staggered bursts. The hum of the field steadied. For a moment it seemed like they'd succeeded. The heartbeat had stopped. The air felt clean again. Varen exhaled slowly. Status reports, all decks. One by one, voices came through. Minor power failures, structural stress, but no new anomalies. Relief swept through the chamber like a fragile wave. People slumped against consoles, laughing nervously, crying quietly. Jerk almost allowed himself to believe it had worked. Almost. Then the floor beneath him rippled, not metaphorically. The metal itself moved like water disturbed by a submerged shape. It was subtle, quick, but he saw it, and so did others. A gasp rose from the crowd. The heartbeat returned, not outside the hull, not through the field, but from beneath their feet. Slow, patient, triumphant. And then the Vox speakers across the ship crackled to life. A single voice spoke, soft and intimate, as if whispering directly into each ear at once. "You shook the walls," it said. Now I know where to find the doors. Panic shattered the fragile calm like glass. For a few heartbeats, no one moved. The whisper had cut through the chamber like a knife through silk, soft but undeniable, intimate in a way that made the skin crawl. It wasn't broadcast through the standard Vox channels, that much was obvious. It was everywhere, vibrating through the bulkheads, humming in the teeth, settling beneath the breastbone. Jerk felt it in his bones more than heard it, like a parasite had climbed inside his ribcage to murmur secrets against his heart. Then the screaming started. Someone at the back of Muster Chamber C bolted for the door, eyes wild, knocking over a line of candles. Flame met spilled oil, and the room erupted in chaos as people shoved and scrambled. Overseer Varen bellowed for order, her voice rasping against the rising tide of panic, but the sound was swallowed by the ship itself. The lights dimmed again, not flickering, but dimming deliberately, as if something was watching them and wanted to see their fear more clearly. Jerk staggered backward against the console. His mind clung to the rational, but rationality was a weak thing against the reality they were in. The warp didn't play by rules. It broke them and stitched the pieces into grotesque parodies. The heartbeat under the deck plates had grown louder now, steady and sure, like something waking up beneath a floor it had always considered temporary. Varen slammed her fist into the alarm panel. Klaxons howled across the ship, but the sound felt distant, smothered. She turned to the crew, voice sharp and hoarse. "Seal the doors. Contain this chamber. No one leaves until we stabilize the—" She didn't finish. The floor split. It didn't shatter like metal under stress. It peeled. The deck plates bent upward like petals opening on some obscene flower, revealing not wiring and support beams but a void that shouldn't have existed, a hollow blackness that seemed to breathe. Cold rushed upward, carrying with it a smell like burning incense and rotting meat. Someone leaned too close and was simply gone, sucked downward in a blur of motion too fast to comprehend. The void pulsed, and the heartbeat was no longer distant. It was here. Jerk's instincts screamed to run, but his legs betrayed him. He dropped to the floor as the chamber tilted subtly, like the entire ship had shifted orientation. People were sliding toward the rift now, grabbing for consoles and railings. The Emperor's statue toppled, smashing into the dais with a sound like bones breaking. Candles scattered, flames sputtering out as the air thinned. And then came the voices. Not one, not the whisper. A chorus. Thousands, maybe millions, overlapping, shrieking, laughing, chanting, singing half-remembered lullabies. It wasn't sound that came from any one direction. It came from inside. Every ear, every skull, every heart resonated with the sound. A tech priest ripped the interface plugs from his skull and clawed at his own face until his blood slicked the floor. A young ensign started reciting a litany of protection, then abruptly switched to a lullaby from her childhood, and sobbed through the words as if apologizing to someone unseen. Varen grabbed the nearest loudhailer and roared into it. "Engineering, respond. Lock down C-deck now." The reply came, distorted and delayed. "Deck locked, cannot, something in the conduits moving." Jerk forced himself to crawl toward a control panel. His rational mind clung to one thought. If the void was expanding, there might be a way to reinforce the bulkheads, reroute field energy, something. He slammed his hand onto the manual overrides, forcing the system to display structural schematics. What he saw made his breath hitch. The void beneath the chamber wasn't a singular anomaly. There were several, dozens, all over the ship, like bubbles forming beneath skin before a blister erupts, and all of them were expanding. Slowly but inevitably, converging toward the central plasma conduit, the beating heart of the vessel. "We're being hollowed out," he whispered. Varen heard him, her jaw tightened. "Then we cut it out before it spreads." She turned to the terrified crowd. "You heard him. Grab tools, anything you can use. We're sealing the chamber from below. We're not giving this thing our ship without a fight." That was Varen, unyielding even with damnation staring her down. Her voice rallied some of the crew. Others remained frozen, paralyzed by terror. But Jerk found himself moving, because doing something was better than doing nothing. They descended into the maintenance access shafts beneath muster chamber C. The passageways were narrow, claustrophobic, lined with pipes that hissed like serpents. Emergency lumen strips cast everything in a sickly yellow light that made shadows seem to move on their own. The heartbeat echoed down here louder, the metal skin of the ship vibrating with every pulse. Halfway down the shaft, they encountered their first impossible corridor. The ship had always been a maze, but this was different. A junction that should have led to plasma conduit maintenance had changed. The walls curved in unnatural ways, angles bending where they shouldn't. The lumen strips were arranged wrong, as if the corridor had been assembled by someone who had read the blueprints but didn't understand them. A young crewman, Darren, whispered, "This isn't supposed to be here." The corridor answered. The lumen strips flared bright white and then went dark. In that sudden darkness they heard something moving, wet, dragging, eager. The air filled with the stench of ozone and decay. Someone screamed, high and sharp, and the sound was cut off like a snuffed candle. When the lights flickered back on, Darren was gone. In his place was a trail of smeared handprints leading down the warped corridor. Jerk wanted to turn back, but Varen didn't hesitate. She drew her service pistol and advanced. "Keep moving. It's trying to divide us. Don't let it." They pushed forward, deeper into the ship's twisted gut. The corridor narrowed until they had to turn sideways to squeeze through, the metal warm against their backs. Whispers slid through the air like oil, each voice targeting someone different, promising impossible things. Jerk heard his sister's voice, dead 10 years now, calling him home. Another crew member dropped his wrench and ran screaming back the way they came, vanishing into the dark. They reached the lower chamber. It should have been a simple maintenance room, a circular space around the conduit with access ports and tool lockers. Instead, it looked like the ship had grown something. The walls bulged inward and outward in organic shapes, like muscle beneath skin. The void pulsed here, visible through a thin membrane of reality that shimmered like oil on water. Every beat sent ripples through the air. "This is the source," Jerk said hoarsely. Varen set her jaw. "Then we kill it here." But the thing in the walls had other ideas. The membrane split open like a wound. Hands, not human hands, but twisted mockeries, too many fingers, joints bending backward, erupted outward. They didn't grab or strike. They reached like children begging to be lifted. The crew fell back, some firing las pistols, others just screaming. Bolts of light disappeared into the darkness like pebbles tossed into a lake. The void laughed. Not audibly, not in a way that could be recorded, but they felt it, like the walls themselves were in on some private joke. And then the lights died again. For a heartbeat, Jerk stood in perfect blackness, and in that blackness something touched his shoulder. Cold, deliberate, curious. When the lights snapped back on, 3 crewmen were gone, and the void had grown larger. Varen's voice was low and fierce. "No more running. If we lose this chamber, the heart goes next, and if the heart goes, we all die," Jerk finished for her. She nodded. "Then we hold here." But even as she spoke, the ship shifted. Not physically. Conceptually, corridors rearranged themselves. Bulkheads sighed. The walls pulsed with the heartbeat of something that had already decided they belonged to it. Above them, muster chamber C was gone, swallowed. The ship was no longer a ship. Jerk felt that truth settle into his bones as the maintenance chamber trembled beneath their boots, not from any structural instability but from the slow, patient breathing of something alive. The heartbeat was deafening now, not loud in the conventional sense but present. It saturated the air, made every panel hum, made the blood in their veins throb to its rhythm. Varen barked orders to the remaining crew, but even her voice carried a tremor now. They were far beneath the hab decks, in the twisting bowels of a vessel that was being slowly rewritten by forces that didn't obey the laws of reality. Jerk stared at the membrane of oily darkness where the void pulsed. It wasn't expanding through brute force. It was growing, insinuating itself through the structure like mold through damp walls. Every ripple seemed to seep further along conduits and bulkheads, spreading tendrils that made the metal look almost organic. Somewhere far away, deep in the labyrinth of corridors, another alarm began to sound, then abruptly cut off. The ship was fragmenting, piece by piece. "Reroute auxiliary power to this chamber," Varen snapped, pulling a data spike from her belt and jamming it into the wall port. "If we can boost the containment fields along the plasma conduit, maybe we can burn it out." Jarek forced himself to focus. Rational thought was his last weapon against the encroaching madness. He joined her at the panel, fingers flying over the manual overrides. The ship's systems responded sluggishly, like something was resisting them from the inside. Warning sigils bloomed across the screen: energy fluctuation, conduit instability, unauthorized structural modifications. "Half the circuits aren't responding," Jarek muttered. "It's rerouting power away from us, like it knows what we're trying to do." "It does know," Varen growled, "and I don't care, keep pushing." Behind them, the crew were fortifying the chamber as best they could, dragging tool crates to form makeshift barricades, welding hatches shut, daubing hurried wards of the Imperial aquila on the walls with oil and blood. The air was thick with incense from broken purifier sensors, mingling with the copper tang of sweat and fear. A low moan echoed through the corridors, as if the ship itself was mourning what it was becoming. Then the whisper returned. It slithered through the chamber like smoke, winding around their ears, settling against their skulls. But this time it didn't come as indistinct murmurs. This time it spoke. "Kalen Voss." The name cut through the room like a scalpel. Jarek froze. That wasn't his name, but it was a name. A human name. Everyone turned, searching for the source, though they all knew there wasn't one. The void pulsed brighter. "You sustained the light once, do you remember?" Jarek's skin prickled. He didn't know a Kalen Voss. He didn't want to, but the void wasn't speaking randomly. It was digging into someone. One of the tech adepts at the back of the chamber suddenly dropped his welder and clutched his head, screaming. "We remember you, Kalen." The man's scream became laughter, high and cracked. He staggered toward the membrane like a moth drawn to a flame. Two crewmen moved to stop him, but he was fast, faster than he had any right to be. He hurled himself into the void and it accepted him. There was no impact, no sound of tearing flesh. He simply vanished like he had stepped through a curtain. A heartbeat later, his voice joined the chorus beyond the membrane. Something inside Jarek cracked a little then. That man had worked beside him for 3 years. They'd shared ration packs and complained about shift rotations. And now he was gone, swallowed like he had never existed. Varen slammed a fist into the wall. "No more losses, do you hear me? Not one more." But the void was listening. It pulsed again and the lights died. Darkness fell like a hammer. In the blackness, the whisper became 1,000 whispers. They clawed at the edges of sanity, promising safety, power, release. Jarek felt something cold brush against his cheek, and he jerked away with a choked sound. Somewhere to his left, someone was dragged off their feet with a scream that turned into gurgling silence. Lasfare burst wildly in the dark, searing afterimages into retinas. Then light returned, not from the lumen strips but from the void itself. It glowed now, deep red like molten iron, casting warped shadows across the chamber. In that light they saw the walls weren't metal anymore. They moved, slowly like muscles contracting beneath skin. Pipes pulsed like veins. The ship was being remade. Jarek grabbed Varen's shoulder. "If we can't burn it out, we contain it. Plasma core override. We flood these decks with raw energy. It'll either kill it or kill us first, but it's the only chance we have." Varen's face hardened. She didn't flinch. "Do it." They worked in silence, except for the whispers pressing against their thoughts. Jarek's hands shook as he keyed in override commands that were never meant to be used. He bypassed safety checks, rerouted flow regulators, and forced energy into circuits not designed to carry it. Warning lights blazed crimson. The void reacted. It pulsed violently, and the chamber shook as if struck by a giant's fist. The membrane bulged outward, distorting like a soap bubble seconds before bursting. The heartbeat sped up. The red light intensified, filling the chamber with a suffocating heat. "Almost there," Jerk muttered. Then the walls split open. Not like the deck earlier. This time they didn't peel, they burst. The conduits ruptured and outpoured a tide of things. Not demons, not fully. Shapes half-formed, made of shadow and flame and memory. They clawed their way into reality with shrieks that tore at the mind more than the ears. One crewman collapsed instantly, blood streaming from his nose and eyes. Another fired until his power cell went dry, then fell to his knees, laughing hysterically. Varen drew her sidearm and started firing precise bursts, each shot a prayer. "Hold the line," she shouted. The barricades shuddered as the half-formed creatures slammed into them. Their bodies shifted constantly, sometimes humanoid, sometimes not. Jerk saw one take on the shape of his mother before twisting into something eyeless and jagged. It wasn't just physical assault. Every blow came with a psychic pressure, a push against the fragile walls of their minds. Jerk finished the final override. The console screamed warnings at him, but he ignored them. Power surge in 5-4. The void convulsed. A chorus of voices rose in unison. 3. The lights overhead exploded, showering them with sparks. 2. The half-formed thing stopped attacking and looked at him, all at once, as if realizing what he intended. 1. He slammed the lever down. The chamber erupted in white-blue light as plasma energy flooded through the conduits. The heat was unbearable. Reality itself seemed to waver like a mirage. The void screamed, not a sound, but a feeling like the entire ship had been filled with nails scraping across glass. The membrane thrashed and then imploded, sucking the half-formed things back into itself. For a heartbeat it worked. The void shrank, folding in on itself, light dimming. The creatures wailed and were dragged away. Then something answered from the other side. The glow flared brighter than ever before, and for a fraction of a second, Jerk saw through the membrane. He saw a place that wasn't a place, endless, shifting, made of thoughts and hunger. And something vast stared back at him, not with eyes, with attention. The chamber cracked, the deck buckled, and the void began to expand again, faster this time, as if furious. Jerk stumbled backward, horror clawing at his throat. It's not just growing, it's awake now. Varen grabbed his arm, hauling him toward the exit. "Then we run. We can't win here." Behind them, the chamber collapsed into itself as the void consumed it. The ship groaned like a wounded beast. Somewhere far above, emergency klaxons wailed and then were abruptly silenced. They fled into corridors that were no longer theirs. The walls twisted around them, doors opening to places they didn't lead, corridors looping back on themselves in impossible geometries. Crew they encountered were either mad, dead, or missing pieces of themselves that weren't physical. And always, beneath it all, the heartbeat followed. The storm outside had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse than the screaming. Warplight bled through the ship seams like veins beneath translucent skin, pulsing in slow, wet rhythms. Every corridor had taken on the same warped geometry now, walls sagging inward like breathing lungs, doors no longer aligned, shadows moving without source. The sanctity of wrath was no longer a vessel, it was something alive and hungry. Brother Sergeant Lucan stood at the shattered viewing deck, his armor scorched and dented helm locked beneath his arm. His face, usually carved from discipline and certainty, was pale and trembling. Around him lay what remained of his squad, 3 brothers, 2 unconscious, 1 kneeling and praying in broken low Gothic. None of them spoke of what they had seen in the last hour, because naming it might make it real. Elias forced his way through the flickering bulkhead door, his astropath's robes torn and slick with blood. His face was drawn tight, his eyes clouded with that glassy fog of someone who had seen too far into the Imperium. His psychic hood sparked intermittently like a dying star. "It's not done," he rasped. "You feel it, don't you?" Lucan turned, jaw set. He didn't need the warning. The air itself trembled with the low, resonant thrum of a heart that wasn't mechanical. The warp had them now. No more micro jumps, no way back. Somewhere deep inside the vessel, something was moving toward the bridge. Below decks, Navigator Saris was being dragged by two junior crewmen through a corridor that seemed to stretch and contract as they moved. She could barely breathe. Her third eye burned beneath its protective plate, as if some unseen hand were pressing against it from the inside. She'd glimpsed it moments before, the thing that lurked beyond the Jellar field's failing perimeter. Not a demon, not in any conventional sense. Something older, slower, and patient. It hadn't torn through, it had waited. And when the Jellar field had finally stuttered, it slipped through like ink bleeding into water. Now, with every step, Saris could feel it pulling her toward the ship's heart, like gravity in reverse. The crewmen holding her stumbled as the lights above them guttered and dimmed, and a soft whispering started, thousands of voices overlapping, speaking in a language none of them knew but all instinctively feared. Lucan rallied what was left of his men. "We hold the bridge," he ordered. "Whatever comes through, we hold." His words sounded strong, but he felt the hollowness of them. One of his brothers, Decius, leaned close, his breath rattling. "Brother Sergeant," he whispered, "what if the bridge is exactly where it wants us?" Lucan didn't answer. He couldn't. The vox crackled suddenly, and the voice that came through was fractured, wet like someone speaking underwater. "Lucan, Elia's down below. It's inside the engines." It was Captain Orman. Except Orman had died 2 hours ago, torn apart by the implosion of the Navigator's sanctum. Elia stiffened beside him, eyes wide. The voice wasn't mimicking, it was Orman. Warp echoes were bleeding into reality, dragging the dead along with them. They descended into the lower decks, moving through corridors that pulsed and narrowed like a throat swallowing them whole. The further they went, the harder it became to distinguish what was metal and what was flesh. Panels wept a clear, viscous fluid. Deck plating flexed under their boots. At one junction, they passed a shrine to the god emperor that had been erected decades ago by the crew. Now, the candles burned black, and the aquila had sprouted veins. Elias paused there, almost reverent, as if realizing they were walking deeper into hell. He placed his hand on the corrupted symbol. "It's feeding on us," he said softly. "On our memories, our prayers, our fears. It's building itself out of what we are." In the engine cathedral, the core burned dim and sickly, its light swallowed by a swirling vortex that hung in the air like a tear in reality. Around it floated debris, bones, torn plating, scraps of uniforms, all orbiting a dark center, and at the heart of it all was the shape. Not fully formed, not entirely seen, but sensed. A void that had put on the idea of flesh. Elias fell to his knees, clutching his temples. "It's not just here," he gasped. "It's becoming us." Lucan and his brothers formed a defensive ring, bolters raised, though they knew such weapons were meaningless. The warp thing didn't rush them. It studied them. Then slowly reality buckled. The ship's gravity inverted for a heartbeat. Blood ran upward. Decius screamed as his armor began to sink into his skin, the ceramite plates fusing to muscle, tendons snapping as something rewrote him from the inside. Elias reached out blindly, psychic energy flaring from him in raw, uncontrolled waves. "Lucan, it wants a host," he shouted. "It's looking for one of us." And then Saris appeared in the doorway, eyes wide and bleeding, dragged by the crewmen. Her third eye was open, burning like a sun. The thing turned toward her. Lucan moved without thinking, slamming his shoulder into her and knocking her aside as the void surged forward. He fired his bolter into its center, not to kill it but to distract it. For a moment, reality tore. The sound was like all the screams of the dead echoing through a cathedral. The vortex rippled, and something answered back from inside it. Elias' mind touched it then, not physically but through the warp, where thoughts were knives and memories bled. He saw its origin not as a creature but as a happening, a void storm, ancient and starless, that had drifted through the warp for millennia, consuming anything that strayed too close. It didn't have a name because it didn't need one. It was hunger given form. It was the consequence of humanity's arrogance to travel where they shouldn't, and now it was inside them. Lucan grabbed Elias by the shoulder. "Can we stop it?" he barked. Elias' eyes were wet and empty. "No, but maybe we can trap it." It was a desperate plan: overload the engine core and seal the warp tier inside a collapsing singularity. It would mean the destruction of the ship, of everyone aboard. But if the thing escaped into real space, it wouldn't stop with them. Saris nodded weakly, already understanding. "Then do it," she whispered. But before they could move, Decius convulsed violently, armor splitting apart as another voice poured from his mouth, deeper and colder than any human sound. "You offer yourselves as cages," it said, "but I am the storm, and storms do not yield." His eyes rolled back, replaced by swirling voids. The entity had chosen its host. Lucan raised his blade, every fiber of his being trembling. Elias began the psychic chant to destabilize the core. Saris dragged herself toward the control altar, leaving a trail of blood behind her. The deck groaned as the ship began to tear itself apart from within. And through it all, the void thing laughed, a sound that wasn't sound, vibrating inside their bones. The sanctity of wrath was dying, and if they failed, reality itself might follow. The engine cathedral had become a battleground between realities. The vortex at its core swelled outward like a lung drawing breath, each pulse dragging the ship further from the Imperium's laws and deeper into something nameless. Steel bulkheads warped like wax near fire, cogitator banks exploded in showers of molten glass, and the air itself rippled with feverish heat and cold in alternating waves. Lucan stood at the center of it all, framed against the sickly engine light, sword drawn, staring down at what was left of Decius. His battle brother no longer moved like a man. Each step was a convulsion, his bones cracking audibly as the void remade him into a vessel worthy of its storm-born hunger. His once blue eyes were now pits of swirling night, dragging in light, hope, and courage like debris circling a black hole. Elias struggled to hold his mind together. The warp screamed in his head, not metaphorically, but in literal shrieking tones that split thought like blades. Blood streamed from his ears and nostrils, his psychic hood sparking violently. He reached through the immaterium toward the failing core systems, weaving desperate threads of will to override safeties that had not been touched since the ship's christening. Each code lock felt like peeling away layers of his own sanity. Saris, her third eye still burning like a brand, stumbled toward the engine altar, dragging herself by raw fingers across a deck that pulsed like muscle. Every inch was agony. Her skin was cracked from warp exposure, her robes soaked with sweat and blood, but her navigator senses burned clear and bright. She could see the creature's intentions, not thoughts, but currents. It was pulling the ship deeper into the warp's heart, not to destroy it, but to anchor itself. The sanctity of wrath would become its chrysalis. Decius, or rather, the thing that wore his armor, lunged. Lucan met him halfway. Their clash sent shockwaves through the cathedral, sword against clawed gauntlet, ceramic grinding and splintering. Lucan fought like a cornered lion, every motion honed by centuries of gene-forged war, but there was a growing weight in his limbs. The void's influence pressed on him like a mountain, crushing resolve beneath cosmic indifference. Decius moved without hesitation or pain, his body no longer bound by mortal fatigue. Each strike was accompanied by bursts of warp light that burned holes in the floor. Lucan was thrown back against a twisted support pillar, armor denting with a sickening crunch. He tasted blood inside his helmet. The creature didn't gloat, it didn't need to. It was inevitable, and it knew it. Elias screamed something wordless as his mind locked into the core systems. He bypassed the final security layers, forcing the machine spirit into submission. The engine cathedral roared in protest as ancient failsafes began to unravel. The singularity trap sequence was primed, but it needed manual activation from the altar, where Saris was still crawling. She reached up with trembling fingers, brushing against the control sigils. A pulse of energy shot through her, lifting her from the floor like a rag doll, slamming her against the altar hard enough to crack bone. She didn't scream. She pressed her bleeding palm to the final rune, eyes blazing with unearthly light. "By the Emperor's gaze," she whispered hoarsely, "I bind thee." The vortex reacted instantly. Its shape collapsed inward as if the storm had realized too late what they were attempting. Tendrils of raw unreality lashed out, tearing chunks of metal and bodies into its spinning maw. Crewmen who had been cowering in the shadows were yanked screaming into nothingness. Decius let out a roar, not his voice but the storm's, an endless howl of hatred that shook the ship. He charged for Ceres. Lucan intercepted, blade flashing. Their impact cracked the floor beneath them. Lucan drove his sword up beneath Decius's arm, through ribs, into what should have been his second heart. But the wound didn't slow him. The void creature grabbed Lucan by the throat, lifting him off the ground like a toy. The edges of Lucan's vision darkened as armor servos strained and cracked. Elias saw it happening but couldn't break his concentration. The singularity trap sequence needed one last psychic push to ignite. He forced his consciousness into the warp, tearing through the storm's outer layer like a man swimming through broken glass. He found the center, not a mind but an absence, a place where meaning went to die, and he spoke into it. He didn't use words but memories, the faces of his brothers, the sunlit training fields of his youth, the banners of the Imperium. He hurled everything that made him Elias into that void. For a moment, the storm faltered. Lucan seized the chance. With a roar that was equal parts defiance and farewell, he activated his armor's emergency power surge, channeling every last reserve into his blade. He drove it deeper into Decius's chest, pushing until they both stumbled toward the vortex. "You will not have this ship," he growled. Decius's claws tore into his armor, but Lucan held him fast. With one final shove, he forced them both into the storm's edge. The void screamed. Reality bent inward. Lucan disappeared into the swirling darkness, dragging the host with him. Ceres slammed her hand down on the final control rune. Elias released his psychic grip. The singularity trap activated. A column of blinding light erupted from the core, slicing through the cathedral like the Emperor's own wrath. The vortex imploded, collapsing on itself with the force of a dying star. The creature howled, not in pain but in fury, its meal denied. Then, silence. The kind of silence that follows the death of something too large to comprehend. The sanctity of wrath shuddered violently as the collapsing singularity consumed the warp breach. Bulkheads tore apart, decks buckled, and fire raced through the corridors. Ceres slumped against the altar, her vision fading, but through the blur she saw Elias staggering toward her, his mind fractured but alive. "It's done," he whispered, barely audible. "We are free." But they both knew free was a relative term. The ship was breaking apart, drifting between real space and the warp. Escape pods were long gone, most of the crew dead or worse. Yet, impossibly, they had stopped the storm from spreading. As the engine core's singularity consumed itself, a faint whisper echoed through the collapsing cathedral. Not from the storm, but from somewhere deeper. This was only one breath, it said. The warp is endless. Then it was gone. Elias helped Ceres to her feet. Together they stumbled toward the upper decks, through corridors now eerily still. The warp light had faded, but the scars remained. Flesh fused to metal, walls breathing softly, echoes of voices that weren't there. They reached the viewing deck, what was left of it, and looked out into the fractured void. The ship was drifting, yes, but real space glimmered faintly at the edge of the darkness. A way out, maybe. Ceres closed her bleeding third eye, whispering a final prayer to the Emperor. Elias looked toward the stars where Lucan had vanished. "He held the line," he said softly, "right to the end." The navigator nodded. "That's what Astartes do." The sanctity of wrath creaked like a wounded beast, but it was still moving. Perhaps the Imperium would find them. Perhaps they would die out here forgotten. But the warp storm had been contained, and for now that was enough. Far behind them, somewhere in the endless immaterium, something stirred. The storm had been denied, but not destroyed. And the warp never forgets.